This time last year, I made a video comparing Nuke to Fusion from the perspective of a professional compositor. That video was very well received and it reached audiences outside of my normal demographic, including a lot of people that actually use Fusion. And as a result of this, the comments of that video were filled with people leaving very constructive feedback on how I could improve the video. Many of the things that I pointed out as issues that I had with Fusion, people suggested solutions for, which was really cool. So ever since then, it's been in the back of my head that I'd like to do a follow-up of that video that's slightly more well-informed. In the background for the last few weeks, I've been learning how to use Fusion properly, and this video is the result of that. This is the plate that I'm going to be working on, and the aim of this video is to tackle all of the tasks that I would normally do in Nuke and replicate every single one of those in Fusion. That's going to include using ST maps to underdistort the footage, doing a 3D camera track and exporting some geometry and the camera to Blender for use in CG, preparing the HDRI for use in Blender by doing some paintwork to remove the sun, color balancing the plates using a Macbeth chart, and then once the renders are done, obviously compositing all the CG. So let's see how it goes.
Just before we start, if you'd like to get your hands on the project files from this video, they're available on my Patreon. You can get access to the Blender scene with the textured model and all the lighting set up, the Nuke script exactly how I've comped the shot in this video, as well as the footage if you'd like to download it for yourself and practice. Okay, back to the video. So the very first step is importing my footage, and then I'm using an ST map that I generated from a lens grid to underdistort the footage. Once the footage has the distortion removed, I write that out as a secondary plate from Nuke, and then I bring it back in and start doing a camera track of the scene. I'm really used to Nuke's 3D tracker, I think it works really well, and you don't have to press many buttons to get a good result. Here I'm just punching in my camera parameters like my focal length and the film back size, which is the size of your sensor, and then set off the camera track. Once it's done, I set up the ground plane and the origin of my 3D scene, and then just improve the track slightly by removing some of the trackers with higher errors. Then from there I can export a camera and some geometry for the floor and just check if the track is actually working. In Nuke I normally do this by putting a checkerboard on the card on the floor, and then I overlay this on my footage and turn the mix down. The straight lines on the checkerboard make it really obvious if the card is slipping at all on the floor. In this case it stuck really well and the track was very usable. Once I'm happy, I add the card and the camera to a scene node, and then I use the right geo node to export an alembic from Nuke to Blender. Then just before hopping into Blender I prepared the HDRI in Nuke as well. There's loads of different ways to do this. One of my favourites is to use a node called the PXF filler. You can draw a mask around something and then the colours on the edge of your mask will be dragged inwards and fill the hole. So in this case it fills up the area where the sun is with the blue sky, which is perfect. And then finally I just clone painted out some of the streaks from the lens flares. Then I export that from Nuke as well and I'm ready to hop into Blender. The first thing I did was import the alembic of the 3D scene. So I've got my camera and my geometry for the floor. Then I bring in my undistorted plate as the background image of my camera so I can see what I'm doing. Next up I brought in the 3D model. In this case I'm using a motorbike that I downloaded for free from Sketchfab. To get the scene scale correct I made a cube that was the same dimensions as a motorbike. Then I scaled the motorbike to fit inside the cube so I know it had the correct proportions. Once that was placed correctly, I brought in my HDRI to light the scene, and using the mapping node, I changed the Z rotation until it's aligned correctly with my shot. Then I can add in a sun lamp and orient it so that the shadows of my CG objects are going in the same direction as the live action footage. And at this point I also set my ground plane to be a shadow catcher so I could see it overlaid on the footage slightly easier. The model was really good, but the materials were very basic, so I just did some quick look dev and applied some extra textures to make them look a bit more photorealistic. I did a few final steps to embed it into the shot better, like using a UV project modifier to project the undistorted plate onto the floor. It's good practice to do this for all shots, but particularly because this bike has some very glossy materials on it, you'll actually see the floor reflected in them very clearly, so it's even more important on CG objects like this. Then in the compositor I set up my render passes. For this it's super simple, I just did a beauty pass and then a shadow pass. And then for the final tweak before rendering, I just made sure that my HDRI was properly calibrated to work with the Macbeth chart, so that it would match my footage. Jacob from InLight VFX has a really good video about this. It's worth checking out, he explains it in a lot more detail, and my workflow follows pretty much the exact same steps. The main purpose of this is making sure that your HDRI has the correct white balance and everything. Once they match, all the colours should be uniform across the board and it's ready to render. And now we can get onto the fun stuff, which is putting the renders together. This is a pretty straightforward compositing setup, so it's going to be a pretty small script, which is always nice. I start off by bringing in the render of the bike, and then applying my compositing template, which is just an unpremult and premult setup with a copy node. Then I merge this over the footage and reapply the lens distortion using another ST map from earlier that's the inverse of the undistorting one. This takes the lens distortion from the specific lens I had on my camera at the time and applies it to the CG. Then I set my black point. I like to do this by turning the viewport gain all the way up and then sampling one of the darker areas of the live action footage. After the lens distortion setup, I'm then shuffling out the shadow pass and multiplying this over the plate using a second merge node. I'm using a grade node after that just to make some tweaks to the density and the colour of the shadow. Then finally, I added a very subtle defocus just to take the edge off the sharpness of the CG render compared to the plate, and also added an exponential glow node. I turned it right down so it's nice and subtle, and this is just helping to emulate the bloom you get when the sun reflects off very bright objects in the scene. I added an exposure node right at the end as well. I gamma down the viewport so I can see where all the highlights are living in the shot, and then I just brought the exposure down on the bike slightly to fall in place. And with that done, this is what the final shot looks like, and we can even add a color grade to make it look a bit more sexy. In principle, it's quite a simple shot, but this simple task has combined pretty much all the disciplines that go into making most of my YouTube videos. So now let's see how Fusion holds up doing the same thing. One of the main things that people pointed out in the comments of the last video was that I should install Reactor. It's basically a massive third-party library of plugins that people in the Fusion community have made, and it adds a huge amount of the functionality that I said was missing by default in my previous video. So straight away this made a massive difference, so I installed Reactor and downloaded several nodes that people had made to replicate some of the Nuke nodes in Fusion. The second thing that made a big difference to me enjoying using Fusion a lot more second time round was I got the layout working very similarly to Nuke. I think the default Fusion one is pretty rubbish, but to be fair, the default Nuke one is pretty terrible as well. Massive shout out to Zanzals, or One Aspiring Artist, on Discord. We've talked a lot in the background since my previous video about Fusion, and they've been massively helpful in sharing resources and pointing out solutions for things when I had problems. So I got the node graph set up how I like it. I also turned on Arrange to Connected, which makes the nodes snap in line with each other like in Nuke. And I also turned on Force Source Tile Pictures, which gives all of the media nodes thumbnails so you can see what they are, which is much better. And lastly, something I didn't figure out at all in my previous video was getting the viewer set up to work properly with Aces. Basically, you have to load the Aces config file into the viewer so that it can display properly. Then I set my source color space to Aces CG and the output to Rec 709. And once that was set up, it magically started working, which was a huge relief. So I've got my footage as an EXR sequence, which I started off with the same as in Nuke. Next I brought in the understored ST map. Fusion doesn't have a built-in way of using ST maps, so I went through a few on Reactor and eventually found one called ST Mapper, which is the only one that seems to actually process the alpha properly. Then I can crop the overscan that's going outside of the frame borders, and then exactly the same as before, I had a saver node, which is the same as a write node in Nuke, and I just rendered a pre-comp of this undistorted plate. From there I can bring it back in, and then it's time to tackle camera tracking the shot. This was my first time using Fusion's camera tracker, and I think it's really good. I still think I prefer Nuke's, but again, I'm a bit biased because I've used it so much, so it's difficult to say. But I will say that it's very intuitive, works pretty much exactly the same way. I put in my focal length and my sensor size, tweaked some of the settings to add some more tracking points, and then set it off tracking. Once it was done, it was exactly the same process as Nuke. I refined the camera track slightly by filtering some of the worst tracks, and then selected some points on the floor to set my origin and ground plane. Once that's done, I pressed export, which kicks out a 3D camera and some geometry for the floor. I had a quick look at it in 3D space, everything seemed to be working okay, so then I used the FBX exporter to kick it out to Blender. I didn't bother going through the whole process again in Blender, as it was going to be identical anyway. I then jumped back into Fusion and did the same prep work on the HDRI. I'd not used any of the paint tools in Fusion before either, so this was a new one for me. The paint tools in pretty much every software are very similar. There's usually some iteration of the clone brush and then things like the smear and blur brush. Nuke's got quite a few more, and I do actually use them all on a regular basis, so I think Nuke has a definite advantage when it comes to the paint tools. But in this case it wasn't a problem. I just used the clone tool to paint out the sun. It took me quite a bit longer to do it in Fusion compared to Nuke because I'm not used to the tools, but I got there in the end. It was quite blotchy because there's such a gradient in the sky going outwards from the sun. So again, I used a blur node after that just to even that all out a little bit. I used an elliptical mask and just put that around the sun so I could just isolate the blur to that area, and it did exactly what I was after. Again, skipping over the Blender process so I don't show the same thing twice. I've now gone straight into doing the CG comping in Fusion. I bring in both of the render passes. In Fusion I had to use two loader nodes, one for the bike and one for the shadow pass, whereas in Nuke I could just use one read node and shuffle it out, but it's just a different way of working, one's not really better than the other. Then again, I'm using the ST Mapper node to reapply the lens distortion onto the CG renders. I did the shadow pass first and then merged this over the plate and set it to multiply, which overlays it correctly. Then I copied the lens distortion setup onto the bike, and that gets merged over the top of everything. I used a color correct on the shadow pass again, just to make them a little bit darker. Then I add a color correct onto the CG bike, and I make sure to turn on pre-divide post-multiply, which is the same as unpre-molting and pre-molting in Nuke. After hunting through the menus a bit, I found the best way to set the black and white point was to use the output level sliders. So I gammaed down the viewport and set my highlights to be the correct level, and then I increased the gain and set the black point. I found a version of exponential glow-on reactor as well, which is basically exactly the same thing that's in Nuke. So I put that on top of the CG to get the same bloom effect from the highlights. I just dialed it in until it was very subtle again. I also applied the same subtle defocus just to take the sharpness out of the render. And at this point I'd mirrored the Nuke setup exactly, so it was time to render it out and compare the two. And this is the final comp from Fusion. And again with the colour grade applied. Interestingly, the main difference if I flick between them is that the lens distortion is different between the two. I'd imagine that's just a difference in how Fusion has handled the ST map.
Okay, so conclusion time. I've actually got some notes so I don't miss anything important. I think right off the bat it's worth saying that this time around my experience using Fusion was very positive. Like I said earlier, once I got it laid out how I liked, I immediately felt more comfortable. The only real negative that I found while working on this shot was the lens distortion workflow. Like I said, with the built-in nodes, Fusion doesn't have a way of properly using ST maps. There's about 3 options on Reactor that I tried. The third one, ST Mapper, does actually work. But I have to say it took me about an hour to find that, whereas Nuke has a built-in ST map node. So the same as I said in the last video, I would still argue that Nuke out of the box has a much more comprehensive toolkit than Fusion for the visual effects pipeline. The second thing I would say is that generally speaking, functionally, they're both pretty similar. And so a lot of the preferences from artist to artist are just subjective. However, there are a couple of things that Fusion objectively can't do that Nuke has capability for. And the main one, which I think a lot of people aren't going to be so familiar with, and will not matter at all unless you're working at a big visual effects studio anyway, is deep compositing. It's quite complicated, so I'm not going to go super into it, but essentially deep compositing is a workflow where the pixels are rendered from 3D with actual depth data. So I'm not talking about just having a depth pass that's a gradient going through your scene. There's actual depth data that's associated with the pixels so that the computer knows how far back they are in space. And this gives an enormous amount of flexibility in compositing when it comes to working with CG renders. You can do things like extremely high fidelity Z defocusing. Traditionally, this would be done with a depth pass, which most compositing softwares can already do. However, because of the nature of this just being a 2D channel that's utilized in compositing, it creates lots of edge issues. In deep compositing, this essentially works flawlessly, pretty much as if you render the depth of field out of the 3D software package. There's loads of other things you can do with deep as well. You can do things like placing roto and cards behind 3D objects in the scene, without having to go in and do any roto or using cryptomats and trying to blend the objects together. It's extremely advanced, it's really, really heavy, and most amateur visual effects artists won't even know what it is and will probably never use it. But it is worth noting that that's something that Nuke can do over Fusion. I will still say, and I want to reiterate again, that this is entirely my own opinion, but personally from my perspective working as a professional and the things that I have to work on a day-to-day basis, I still think Nuke is considerably better than Fusion. Yes, Fusion is used at VFX studios as well, and I'm not denying at all that it can totally handle most professional jobs no problem. But there is still a reason why if you go to any of the really big VFX studios, everybody's working in Nuke still. And on that topic, let's go into the subject that I think most people brought up in the comments, which is the price difference. As you probably know, Fusion comes included in the free version of DaVinci Resolve. And if you want to upgrade to the studio version, I think I paid £295 for a lifetime software license. Comparatively, Nuke is a subscription-based software now. There's a few different versions you can get. For students and aspiring visual effects artists, there is Nuke non-commercial, which is free. It's limited to 1080p HD. A step up from that is Nuke Indie, which I had for a couple of years. This costs about £400 a year, and I actually think this is priced pretty fairly. So it's ideal for freelancers and small startups. Full disclosure, I don't pay for my own license. Foundry sponsor my YouTube channel. They gave me a Nuke Indie license for a couple of years, and this year they kindly agreed to upgrade me to a full version of Nuke X. However, if I was going to, I would definitely pay for Nuke Indie. I think it's totally worth it. It's still more expensive than Resolve and Fusion. 1 year of subscribing to Nuke Indie costs more than buying Resolve for a lifetime. So obviously, comparatively, Resolve is much better value. But I work full-time as a visual effects artist. Like I've said, I work at a VFX studio, and for the last few years I've also been doing lots of projects on the side as a freelancer, so people approach me and ask me to work on their stuff, and for the rates that I charge, I would make back the price of the subscription for the year in less than a day. So it's very easy to justify those software prices when you're earning a certain amount. The license that I have now, which is a full licensed version of Nuke X, I think costs about £5,000 a year, which obviously is hugely expensive. So from that perspective, I totally get it. I think Fusion is probably the way to go, and I myself would probably do that as well if I was starting out again now. However, like I've said a few times, this video and the last video are from the perspective of a professional visual effects artist. And so I think it's worth considering that when you get to a certain point and the projects that you're working on become high-end enough, the price of the tools starts to become a little bit less relevant. For example, I would say the vast majority of the projects that we work on as a company have over six-figure post-production budgets. Especially the big jobs can sometimes go up to over $1 million. That's obviously not profit. We do have to actually pay everybody and stuff within the budget for that as well. But you can imagine that suddenly when the jobs are bringing in that much money, the cost of a £5,000 Nuke license starts to become less important. And I think that's what I was trying to convey in my last video, is that pricing aside, Nuke is still, in my opinion, the better tool. And so ultimately you always want to be using the best tool for the job. And if a studio is making enough money from jobs they can afford to pay for the Nuke licenses, then it makes sense that the artists have the tools that they want to use. So there we go. I think that pretty accurately represents how I feel about the two softwares. I definitely have a much better appreciation for Fusion after this video. I quite enjoyed using it, and I would definitely use it again. Like I said last time, I'd love to hear what you think, especially from people in the Fusion community. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. The last video opened up a really healthy dialogue and people were giving some great suggestions, so if a similar thing can come out of this video, then amazing. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Consider liking, subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.